Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for those who are on the East Coast. I'm on Mountain Time, so it's 10 a.m. here. I'm going to give everyone just a couple of minutes to filter in through the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I'll just give it maybe 1 or 2 minutes. I see everyone starting to come in, so.
I still haven't figured out why it takes so long for Zoom rooms to populate.
This is the question of 2020, you know? If we answer anything this year, hopefully it's that. Yeah, it does take a little while. Okay, well, it is 10:02 over here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I think the webinar waiting room will sort of just filter people in over the next few minutes. So welcome everyone to this book talk with Dr. Stephen Wertheim. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I am the Director of Programs at the Truman Center for National Policy and the Truman National Security Project. And I am thrilled to have with us today our special guest, Dr. Stephen Wertheim. Stephen is a historian of the United States and the world. He is Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute. He's also a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. You've probably seen a lot of his work in places like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times. And if you are into British general interest magazines, you will also have seen him as one of the world's 50 top thinkers of the COVID age, which, you know, I tip my hat to you. But he is here today to talk about his new book, Tomorrow the World. I have it right here, Tomorrow the World, the birth of U.S. global supremacy. Just finished it a couple days ago. It's an excellent book, and he talks about, how U.S. leaders first made the decision to pursue military dominance. So Stephen, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Rachel. It's a great pleasure to be on with you, and thanks to everybody who's taking the time this afternoon.
Absolutely. So again, like I mentioned before, you published this new book called Tomorrow the World, the birth of U.S. global supremacy. And basically, this book is a historical account of how the U.S. came to be the world's primary military superpower and how we decided to pursue global supremacy, how we became the global enforcer of international norms. You basically argue that U.S. primacy was a deliberate and well thought out choice rather than some sort of predestined future for the country, as some have argued. And you also get into the history a lot of, isolationism versus internationalism, multilateral institutions, public opinion. So all of these I'd like to get into today. Before I have you sort of give us the premise of this book and tell us how and why you wrote it, I want to let everyone know that Stephen and I are going to chat for probably about 20 or 25 minutes. And then I'd like to turn this over to the audience and go into audience questions. So as he and I are chatting this morning, start thinking about, your questions, what you'd like to bring up, and then go ahead and submit them through the Q&A function, and I will be sure that we talk about them. So be thinking of that over the next 20 or 25 minutes. So Stephen, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the premise of this book and what's your primary argument within it. I'd also be curious as to why you chose to write a historical account of U.S. primacy. I don't feel like it's something that you are necessarily clearly arguing against within the book, but you kind of just laid out the set of realities from the early 1900s that made it happen. So I'll turn it over to you to sort of talk about how this book came to be.
I think that I became interested in writing the book because of my lived experience, which was, in a nutshell, that U.S. military intervention proved very destructive and costly. The society around me as I was growing up, which I did on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., was not having a very fulsome debate about what the United States was doing in the world. That much I kind of detected, which is not to say I was terribly prescient, in the wake of 9/11 or for some time after that or anything like that. But I started to realize that there was this taken for granted consensus that the United States must, of course, be the leading global military power and in fact pursue military dominance across the globe in every region of the globe with pre-positioned or forward deployed forces just about everywhere. And it struck me that no one was really explaining why this incredibly costly and morally questionable as well as strategically questionable role for the United States, why we were doing this. What were the reasons? No one was really pushing back against it, as far as I could see, nor was anyone defending it with good reasons. So that frustrated me. And I did a PhD in history, which explains part of the question about why I wrote a history. But I wanted to actually go back and understand, well, why did the United States embark on this course when we know that what George Washington proposed in his farewell address was clearly not U.S. military dominance? I mean, at some point between then and now, the United States must have adopted a new world role for itself that broke with what it had said its world role should be. And so I kind of embarked on this quest to understand when was the decision made. And to my surprise, found that it was made at a very particular moment in time between, I argue, the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the middle of 1940 and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II. And it was then, I think, that we get a sense of why the United States made a decision to cast aside its longstanding tradition of avoiding military entanglements, so-called, in the old world of Europe and to a lesser degree Asia, and instead decided to embark on global military dominance, not just to defeat the Axis powers in World War II, but to install the United States as the armed underwriter of world order, as people at the time saw it, long thereafter.
So you talk a lot in the book about how the U.S. wanted to stay out of European-style great power politics. And one of the original solutions to that you talk about in the book, especially because the U.S. at the time didn't really want to get involved in World War II. This was obviously before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and before, France fell to Germany. One of the answers here was to own the Western Hemisphere, was to economically dominate the Western Hemisphere. But it became clear, I think, as you tell it, that wasn't going to be economically viable. It seemed like there was no one in the U.S. who was really worried about the U.S. being under military threat by Germany. I mean, we're protected by two very large oceans on either side of us. But it seemed like economically dominating the Western Hemisphere wasn't going to be viable. It wasn't going to allow us to still operate within a capitalist society. And, a German-dominated world order wasn't something that was going to work for us. So was it, at the time, was it an economic decision that really drove us to get involved in World War II? Or was it partially the bombing of Pearl Harbor as well?
So I don't think it was an economic decision. Let's leave Pearl Harbor out of it and focus on the crucial 18 months in the wake of the fall of France to Nazi Germany. And at that point, it seems to American observers that for the foreseeable future, the Axis powers will be in control of Europe. Perhaps more than that, it seems for a while that the Nazis might go on to conquer Britain, potentially take the British fleet, et cetera. And so, Americans, whatever their views on intervention in the war, are very troubled by this state of affairs and have to think about how the United States should respond. Now, one side emerges with a very plausible reading of American history and argues that the United States will be secure territorially within North America and prosperous economically if it sets out to dominate the Western Hemisphere only. In other words, defend the entire Western Hemisphere by force against any outside invasion, but go no further. I actually think that most observers, including those who disagree with that position, thought that a hemispheric existence in that sense would be sufficient to ensure the prosperity of the US economy, which was quite inward looking, and would also be somewhat viable for the Western Hemisphere as a unit. There was a concern, however, among some people who had started doing post-war planning on behalf of the, semi-officially, on behalf of the Roosevelt administration, but for now within the Council on Foreign Relations, they were concerned that the Western Hemisphere unit would not be advantageous in a kind of Cold War stalemate with a Nazi-dominated Europe, assuming that the Nazis would succeed in that effort. And the problem there was that the US-led bloc would have less bargaining power and then potentially be in a kind of inferior geopolitical and geoeconomic competition going forward. But that is some distance, profound distance from saying that the US economy was imperiled or the territory of the Western Hemisphere. So the key question then becomes why the hemispheric position is overtaken by the most influential officials and intellectuals, many of whom are influential with the Roosevelt administration, and decide that the hemisphere is not enough. And in fact, that the United States should basically inherit the world ordering role of the British Empire, something that many at the time are very explicit about, and preserve what some of the post-war planners describe as the maximum possible area of the non-German world, meaning defend that area by force.
Interesting. You were talking about people who have influence within the Roosevelt administration. Something I thought was really interesting that you talked about in the book were a lot of these post-war planners. And a lot of these individuals, I mean, this was a small coterie of individuals from the Council on Foreign Relations. And the State Department basically said, okay, we can leave post-war planning to, this small kind of outside group of individuals who were supported by, a New York-based foundation and who basically took on the post-war planning for the State Department. Can you talk a little bit about how that came to be, like how the State Department came to rely on outside people or outside counsel for this? And do you think that that sort of had some sort of effect on how foreign policy is decided and acted upon today as well?
Yeah, I think there was a unique point in time in this history in which, the US state was really small still, even in the wake of the Great Depression, and especially when it came to foreign policy. Meanwhile, since the turn of the 20th century, and especially since World War I, there had been built up with a lot of support from wealthy Americans and their foundations, a US foreign policy elite, what we today call the establishment or the blob or what have you. And so when the war in Europe broke out toward the end of 1939, these figures were ready to start planning the shape of the world to come after the war, but also understood that the US State Department, for example, was far too short-staffed to be able to do this kind of work themselves. So just 2 weeks after the war in Europe began, representatives of the Council on Foreign Relations went down to DC, met with leaders of the State Department and offered them a really good deal. We will work with you, follow your directives, and undertake significant efforts to start planning the post-war in real time as events unfold. We've already got the funding lined up from the Rockefeller Foundation, and eventually after Pearl Harbor, when the US government was ready to put together a set of post-war planners officially, many of the people in the council migrated into the official US post-war planning effort. There were also these other organizations at the time that just kind of set themselves up to do post-war thinking and planning, including in Henry Luce's Life, Fortune, Time magazine empire. He just starts a post-war planning group with some really formidable intellectuals who are, frantically scribbling memos to each other, and thinking that they can plan the shape of the world to come. And maybe they're right. Maybe they could. It's a remarkable thing. I actually have, I'm obviously critical of the legacy that the U.S. impulse to dominate the world militarily has left us with today. But I also find myself having a lot of sympathy for this kind of civil society, not totally unofficial, obviously, but this effort to react creatively to events around the United States and try to undertake long-range planning. I think we have more difficulty doing that today, in part because the national security state was built up as a result of victory in World War II and then the turn to the Cold War later in the 1940s. So this space for, educated, pretty homogenous voices, but nevertheless outside voices, I think has been closed down, even as the think tank infrastructure in Washington, D.C. is obviously alive and well for better or worse today. And one of the things that I am again ambivalent about, but have a certain degree of nostalgia for about these planners is they were very concerned with the problem of public opinion, of American public opinion. And they understood that U.S. military dominance was a major departure for the country, and attention needed to be paid to how to get the American people to sign up to this kind of activity. And often the approach made by U.S. foreign policy elites then was more democratic, not absolutely democratic, but more democratic than what we see today. For example, the Brookings Institution releases a report, laying out 7 different mutually exclusive options for America's world role with a huge range. Whereas today, what we tend to get are these kind of mass-produced reports, most of them saying the same thing, signed on by a lot of experts attempting to, get the American people nakedly to just sign on, rather than to consider what the choices are in a recognition that we have a properly democratic society. So I think there's a whole lot of lessons there just on the kind of question of how elites relate to the broader political universe that we'd be what am I trying to say? We should pay attention to that and maybe take some cues today, even if for different ends.
So I want to bring us into present day, but I want to ask one more question before we do that. So obviously you talk about the original role, the vision for the United States by, the founding fathers was not a country that would, militarily dominate the rest of the world. That was a decision that was made much later on. And the public, it seemed like, wasn't really wasn't 100% on board with this either. It seemed like in your book, you talk a lot about how people thought about public opinion. You talk a lot about Henry Luce, this publishing mogul who wrote the American Century. Am I getting? I almost said Ed Luce. and so kind of talking about how, the role the media played in this to sort of get the public behind it. So I'd be interested for you to kind of touch on how post-war planners thought about public opinion, how the government thought about public opinion when deciding to change very drastically the original role envisioned for the United States within the world.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that they were concerned with the problem. And they did recognize that the American public had a role to play in a democratic society, and that they shouldn't take it for granted that the public would actually sign on to what they were conceiving.
Yeah.
That alone is kind of remarkable. Now, I go to some length to try and unpack. There's constant references to the problem of public opinion for these post-war planners. And it's something that they're obsessed about in 1941, early in 1942, when the war isn't even going particularly well. Often they are sitting there more concerned with the American public than with, the progress of the war, with external enemies, with what the Soviet Union might mean in the post-war. That's a remarkable thing. And I think to some degree they were concerned about the literal public, and public opinion polls had come along in the 1930s. So they actually had data that they did look at. But to a large degree, when they worry about trying to legitimate the post-war projection of U.S. military power, I also think that they're taking a kind of broader view of things. They're not responding to what the public was signaling at that point in time. Often the public is actually signaling a lot of agreement with what the planners are planning. But they are, I think, to a degree, projecting some of their own anxieties onto the public. They are worried that what they are planning for the United States is antithetical to U.S. tradition and is the kind of imperialism that they themselves would denounce in other countries. I mean, it's the ultimate non-reciprocal role to say that the United States should be the foremost military power and no one else can challenge it for that role. Yeah. And so I think there are some moments which are interesting. I mean, there's some of the planners are like just totally enthusiastic about the prospect of US military supremacy, but others feel that it's tragic, that it's a departure from some worthy American traditions and opens up dangers for the United States and others. So I was interested in capturing that tragedy, that sense of tragedy. And I think the language of public opinion was kind of a way for these planners to express it to each other by saying, well, I think the public would be concerned about this rather than I'm sitting here concerned.
Interesting. All good points. So I want to bring us now into the present day and how the U.S. sort of enacts and also talks about foreign policy at home and abroad. If anyone on this call has read Stephen's work in places like Foreign Affairs and the New York Times, you'll know that he is, at least, this is, that you might categorize yourself differently, but I would say that you are a very loud voice which questions the status quo of U.S. foreign policy, that questions the idea of continued U.S. global primacy. Where does that criticism come from, and what do you think the U.S. has gotten wrong or is doing wrong in the way that we enact foreign policy today?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair characterization, for better or worse.
I think so.
I think a lot of it does come from my own analysis and research. I'm not the first person by any stretch, including in the academy, to suggest that the U.S. pursuit of military dominance has just been a strategic mistake that then leads to moral and humanitarian mistakes as well. There's a theory of restraint as a U.S. grand strategy that, interestingly enough, was developed in the 1990s, and probably because in the 1990s, it seemed to some people that the United States played an important role militarily in counteracting and indeed defeating the Axis and Soviet powers. But in a world without armed totalitarian conquerors, where none were on the horizon, it would be a mistake for the United States to continue in that kind of a role. So my curiosity was in part to explain, why did that happen? Why did the United States continue without much of a second thought and indeed expand its security commitments and ultimately its use of force in the post Cold War period? So I think, my own sensibility, which has to do with the book, but you can read it's a work of history, even written, I think, with a kind of light touch in terms of lessons for today. So one can make different kinds of meanings of it as you'd like and apply it to present circumstances without me, trying to dictate to you what the history means. But my own view is that, the United States has turned armed dominance into something like an end unto itself. In other words, there was an original rationale that was coherent for U.S. armed supremacy. You can debate, different courses that might have been taken at different points in time. But once the credible specter of totalitarian conquest of Europe and Asia was removed, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, armed dominance became something like an end unto itself that has led to, overstretch in strategic terms and a kind of cycle of violence, particularly in the greater Middle East, and endless war. And so I think, it's important. There are different ways one could make a more strategic U.S. foreign policy that does not have military dominance as an end unto itself. But I think in the Trump years, we've actually seen precisely how, nobody really believes that the current president has a strategy to achieve peace through strength, which is a goal that he's several times articulated. And yet the machine seems to run on autopilot, and military spending has increased, and it remains almost an untouchable part of American politics. I think we desperately need to change course. And part of the reason I co-founded the Quincy Institute was to incubate a debate about this. I don't think, policy matters in their particulars are easy questions by any stretch. But good God, we need to have a vigorous debate about these issues. And what I am really concerned about is a foreign policy making class that is somehow unable to even countenance a retraction of America's military role in the world. And I fear going forward that if we're truly unable to countenance that, the consequences, which have been very negative that we've seen to date, will get worse in a more competitive world with powers that really can cause more harm to Americans and to the world order going forward.
I think that tees up this question from the audience really well from someone named Tyler McBrien. Thanks for asking this question, Tyler. Tyler says, so he's with Princeton University's Innovations for Successful Societies. And his question is, what do you think the current state of the restraint movement is today? Is this a turning point? Are restraint ideas entering the mainstream foreign policy establishment, or are we still a long way from that?
It's a great question. I think you can debate that. I debate that myself. So the fact that we're even asking that question, are restraint ideas entering the mainstream, is a question that I don't think could have been asked 5 years ago or at any other point in my own adult lifetime. So that alone shows us something positive to my way of thinking. It's one of the reasons it's an interesting question is that we've seen unlikely presidents of late who ran and gained support partly on, I think, expressing the public's frustration with destructive wars. I don't think Barack Obama would have won the Democratic primary in 2008 were it not for his opposition to the Iraq War at the time. And President Trump also obviously ran on a heterodox message that contained conflicting elements, but some of them included opposition to the Iraq War and indeed to what he's called endless wars in the greater Middle East. So, and who knows, I guess in an alternate timeline, Bernie Sanders might have won this time, or Elizabeth Warren. And then the question would have been actually a really practical one, sort of how do you have enough people in the administration to execute some of the things that an administration wants to do. So there's a very real challenge today that makes it urgent, I think, to have responsible experts ready to implement some ideas if the principals want to go in that direction. On the other hand, in some ways, we are a long way off, at least from profound change in terms of America's world role. And as I've said, despite all the heterodox thinking from presidents of the United States, the broad structure of American military power has basically continued on its course from the end of the George W. Bush administration to the present, expanding security commitments, expanding military budgets, expanding military footprints for the United States. So What I fear is that if the United States isn't able to practice prudent retrenchments and countenance some significant measure of restraint, that it sets us up for a really dangerous situation in the future, where essentially, the U.S. bluff is called perhaps in several theaters at once, and that could be really destructive for allies and partners and for the United States, and could lead to a kind of rapid collapse, which is not anything I think anyone wants to see. So this is a long way of saying I don't know the answer to the question, but it's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, so there's another question from an anonymous attendee, which I wish they had their name on it, because it's actually a really good question. Is it the premise of American hegemony that you question and oppose, or is it just that we focus too much on the military aspect of national power in lieu of elements that are more applicable in the 21st century, like diplomatic and informational power? I want to add to that because you have a really interesting paragraph in your conclusion that I think I think is a good sort of addition to this question. You basically say, in his 1999 speech, Bush named a globe-spanning set of determined enemies for the United States to confront: terrorists and crime syndicates and drug cartels and unbalanced dictators. To these perennial threats to world order, he added two potential challengers to America's preeminent power position. China and Russia, Bush warned, could eventually dislodge the US from paramountcy in Europe and Asia, and Eurasia, in turn, constituted the world's strategic heartland and our greatest priority. Someone could have literally written that paragraph like this morning, and it would still be applicable to the way that the US enacts foreign policy today. So yeah, going back to the question, like, should the US lead but less militaristically? And is it because we focus so much on great power competition like China and Russia? Is that kind of what guides the militaristic aspect of our foreign policy?
By the way, that speech by Bush from 1999, I think the way it was reported was, I think this would be true today. The emphasis was on how Bush was criticizing hubris and what he called missions without end. So Bush was running on, restraining US military power, and yet said all this about a globe-spanning set of enemies that obviously demanded major US military commitment. And this is why I think that the notion that the United States will achieve peace through strength, as presidents since Ronald Reagan have put it, has proven to be a fantasy. As long as the United States is committed to military dominance, of course, we'd all prefer for everyone else in the world to be deterred, I guess. But it certainly didn't happen in the most propitious circumstances imaginable, the late 1990s, the so-called unipolar moment. There's absolutely no reason to think that it's going to happen today or anytime moving forward. And the United States has actually undertaken far more uses of armed force, according to the Congressional Research Service, after the collapse of the Soviet Union than it did throughout the entire Cold War. So in fact, removing one large enemy has caused the United States to find many smaller enemies in its place. So I just think that, and you hear it a lot, that, well, yes, we know that, our challenges today in the 21st century are not primarily military, right? Climate change, pandemic disease, for example. These are transnational and planetary challenges. But look at where our budgets are. Our budgets say that our priority is military dominance. That's what gets more than half of federal discretionary spending year after year without real debate. As long as that's what we're doing, really, we can talk a good game about other things. And I certainly support, making our best effort, much greater effort on climate change, cooperation on diseases, et cetera. But I don't think that we've actually got a grand strategy designed to prioritize those threats, which are threats to where the American people live and work. And on top of that, I think that Americans become less safe when the United States tries to extend military dominance around the world, has a constant set of enemies, that this creates who do threaten U.S. positions, truly, even if they don't or don't need to threaten the United States itself. Then we get into, real conflict, which has already proved destructive, could get worse in an era of great power competition.
That kind of goes into my next question, because you have another couple of sentences in this conclusion that I find very interesting and that I think add sort of to what you were just saying. You basically say, although states often seek to enlarge their military power, to install one's dominance in the name of internationalism is something else. It effectively turns one nation's military supremacy into the prerequisite of a decent world. Is that what the US has done with our military power, do you think? And to kind of add to that question, do you acknowledge that, and this is a question from the audience, do you acknowledge that America's alliances and forward presence is an essential bulwark against a potential liberal hegemon? Those are two kind of different questions, but I think that they kind of they complement each other well.
Okay, all right. So just hold my feet to the fire if and when I forget to answer one of them or part of one of them.
Yeah.
So let me first, you've dangled a lot of red meat in front of me by quoting from the book, because this is a really important issue. As I've suggested, what troubles me, isn't just the U.S. Pursuit of military hegemony, which, at various points in history, we can debate whether that's made the world better off or worse off, or America better off or worse. I don't think, to me, there's not a huge question in my mind about the post 1991 period, but obviously welcome that debate as well. But I think particularly beforehand, I don't have a simple view on that question. But what I think is truly damaging to us is the way the United States has equated internationalism with the global projection of U.S. military power. That is something that I was very interested to understand how it came about. And it came about precisely as U.S. military dominance was decided upon. The very notion of isolationism, the term didn't exist in U.S. political discourse until the 1930s. And what I traced is how it came into being as a way for those who were coming to the view that the United States should become the preeminent military power to try to paper over how they were contradicting America's traditional ideas of internationalism, which had meant until then trying to find ways to either stay out of or transcend the system of power politics. But against isolationism, they could claim that installing the United States as the armed hegemon was, in fact, the only way to make the world a decent place. So transcending power politics could look exactly the same as dominating power politics. That is the contradiction on which we Americans legitimate our own armed dominance of the world. And I think that remains true today because as anybody who's, criticized even a U.S. military intervention, let alone, had the kind of structural criticisms that I'm suggesting, they are liable to be called isolationists just for, suggesting some retraction in U.S. military power, even if they're for robust U.S. engagement diplomatically, economically, on climate change and every other way. Or even if they just want, military dominance of a single hemisphere of the world or beyond that. So, we've got to get over this hangup, but it's a deeply ingrained ideological hangup. I mean, I just was reading the New York Times and its news coverage from a week ago, 2 weeks ago, referring to Donald Trump's isolationism as if it's obvious. I mean, experts do not agree about that, for sure, at a minimum. I think the term is a complete abuse and does not apply to this administration or other administrations prior to Trump. But, it's really damaging that this kind of vocabulary passes for objective journalism. So with respect to the question about alliances, Yeah, so that's it's a great question. And this is something that deserves a lot of careful debate. I don't think we can separate the question of military alliances from US armed hegemony. In many instances, that's what the security commitment consists of for the United States. So, my view is, yes, I am concerned about the potential for armed aggressors to gain strong power in the world. I don't think that's the situation today with respect to Russia or the situation with respect to China. What I'm concerned about is that the United States, though, in essentially dividing the world up with about a third of the countries under the military protection of the United States, the other third implicitly enemies, at least they're not in the club of US-led alliances. I worry that that tends to create antagonisms as well as inhibit a wider cooperation that I think the United States needs to deal with the transnational and planetary challenges that we addressed earlier. That doesn't mean necessarily, abandoning alliances or taking rash moves that would lead US allies and partners in a lurch. But in a lot of cases, we have partnerships that we shouldn't have, particularly in the Middle East. In other cases, and here I would point to Europe in particular, it just does not seem to me appropriate for the United States to be the military guarantor of European security at this point in time. And I think the United States, instead of stifling European efforts to have greater autonomy in security affairs, should be doing just the opposite and welcoming those initiatives, which are real and could be encouraged by the incoming administration if it wished to do so.
Yeah, I've actually, we were talking about this before the webinar went live about this debate between isolationism and internationalism. And, there's a lot of us who feel like we don't really have a home. For me, as someone who studies the transatlantic relationship, I've, looked a lot at how NATO has sort of been the underpinning foundation of the US-European relationship and how I think that's wrong. And I think that it over-militarizes the transatlantic relationship, and we should focus much more on the EU. I've brought up questions about how the US needs to look at our forward presence in Europe and how many troops we have there, how much we spend on initiatives like the European deterrence initiatives that might dissuade Europe from taking on more of the security burden themselves. But then you sort of bring up those discussions, and because there isn't like a middle ground between isolationism and internationalism, you're automatically sort of thrown into the isolationist category, which I really don't think is fair. And I think that as this next generation of foreign policy practitioners, enter the debate, enter the government, they're much less militaristic than previous generations. They're more okay with the idea of the US having a military power that matches it on the world stage. And so I wonder where those debates are going to go going forward. Is an entire next generation of foreign policy practitioners going to be labeled as being anti-military or being isolationist? Or do you think that those beliefs are going to fundamentally shift how the US enacts its foreign policy eventually?
Well, I think we have to just follow our conviction here.
Yeah.
And be confident that we're not isolationists, that the term is itself a smear. And in fact, increasingly, it's going to become less relevant. Donald Trump was elected president when many influential voices in Washington thought they had an ace in the hole. They were going to call him an isolationist. And he played into that in many respects. And the American public, or enough voters in enough states, didn't care, or maybe even thought that the establishment's scorn affirmed the appeal of a new approach that the president was promising. So I think somehow, as a society, we are getting over our fears of isolationism and actually inching toward a more meaningful debate over foreign policy. And I'm starting to laugh because I'm listening to myself, and it sure doesn't feel that way given the state of our political discourse. But I think it's real. I think it's happening. And you mentioned a great point about the generational shift. It's not just anecdotal from people I know. It's confirmed in scientific surveys that the so-called war on terror generation, millennials and below, are just consistently less militaristic in their outlook, less confident that military interventions improve American security or that of anyone else, and even think they attach less importance to U.S. military superiority in the world, which actually continues a pretty constant trend of decline generationally since I believe it's since the greatest generation. So I think long-term trends are heading in a direction where we will be having a more meaningful and specific foreign policy debate. But sure, on most days, it feels like it's not happening quickly enough.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with you on that. And there's a really good question from Jeff Wilson here, where he says there's a constant fear from elected officials of being seen as weak on defense, so much so that they often seem to vote for budgets and other legislation that seems to run counter to their own domestic agenda. And yet most voters do vote along domestic policy lines. So how can we start overcoming that in our electoral politics? And does public opinion nowadays actually factor into, the issues of, the militarization of U.S. foreign policy?
I do think there's some changes in newly elected officials who have been close. They've had to run races fresh recently. They understand where their voters are. Whether they're on the right or the left or in the center, they do tend to have a bit of a different outlook on foreign policy questions, I think. Than where they would have been had they been running fresh, in the height of the war on terror a decade ago or so. That said, it is a genuine problem. I do think if you read, it is remarkable how much support President Trump has had, and I do think his example shows that there's at least scope to be heterodox on foreign policy and execute. He hasn't always executed on some of his better instincts, but nevertheless, if anything, my reading of the political dynamics is that expect to be denounced on, CNN and MSNBC and editorial pages for things, and voters not to care about that or to actually agree with you. So I think, this suggests to me scope for strong leadership if politicians want to go there. So then the question is, why don't they want to go there, potentially? I also think it is important to make connections between the foreign and the domestic. For example, I do not believe that a xenophobic demagogue would have possibly gotten near the White House and in the White House 15 years into the war on terror without, in that period of time, the United States waging war endlessly, and leaders like George W. Bush, as you mentioned, prior to 9/11, portraying basically the whole world as out to get the United States. And so I think this is something that has undermined American democracy, and I think does represent a shift from the middle of the 20th century, when it's much more debatable what the domestic effects of U.S. military and geopolitical competition were, in part because of the nature of the adversary then, fascist, communist, totalitarian challengers against whom the United States defined itself. Now the United States seems to be practicing war constantly, but defining itself against the kind of specter of the whole world. And I think President Trump reflected that back to us. So, unfortunately, the foreign policy expert class tries to, separate foreign policy from life at home, and then pay lip service to, how, oh, you can't really separate these things. And I'm guilty of that too. This is a genuine problem, but we have got to break down these silos and, reach people where they are, and show how some of the things that the United States does in the world really does come back and hurt us at home.
So we're coming up to the end of our time, but I want to wrap it up with just one final question, sort of looking forward over the next 4 years at the Biden presidency, and what it is you expect in terms of U.S. foreign policy in a Biden presidency. I was reading a piece that Jake Sullivan wrote back in 2018, talking about the importance of the middle class, which I think gives some insight into how he is going to act as a foreign policy or national security advisor, but also gives maybe some insight into how Biden is thinking about foreign policy. So what would you kind of hope to see over the next few years, particularly in how, things would change for the better in your opinion? Like, what would signal a shift for the better?
Yeah, well, President-elect Biden ran promising some important things. He said he would bring an end to the forever wars. He hasn't defined that as I would define it. But then again, he has allowed that space to open up to have a debate about that. And he will face a decision early on whether to abide by the terms of the Doha Agreement and fully withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, for example, by May. He's also promised to end the war in Yemen, to end U.S. support, material support for that war. And that would be an important step for him to take. I think, more broadly, the Democratic platform said a number of promising things about U.S. relations with China, the need to avoid a Cold War and cooperate on things like climate change. And I hope the administration will ask itself, fundamental questions, as the National Security Advisor designate said, will truly reimagine our national security, and assess whether a heavy military approach, even if we intend to use it in the most responsible of ways, really does advance U.S. national interests. And in addition, is a responsible thing to bequeath to another administration who may look like the last administration, or may look worse. So, I think there are just a number of things that the people already put into positions here have said that allow an opening. And I think it's really important for those who want to see a less militaristic U.S. foreign policy to work hard, to express their views, to do so in a vigorous way, understanding that they may or may not be adopted by the administration in 4 years, maybe not in 8 years. But we are building something for the future as well. And I think what happened in the Obama years is that there was a lot of discontent, actually, about the way the Obama administration expanded the drone war, for example, expanded the wider war on terror, even while renaming it, and then left the situation that it did to its successor, which turned out to be President Trump. So I think, that's a useful way for all parties to think about how we want things to go this time. So I expect there to be real pressure on the administration this time, greater than there was last time. There may also be a different dynamic in Congress where there's a more vibrant progressive movement represented in Congress, and conservatives who now may be more heterodox and searching in how they want to critique the administration. Whereas before it seemed to be that Republicans were pretty much, lined up in a hawkish way against the Obama administration. So, am I optimistic? I don't know, but I see a lot of good work to be done. That's of great importance, and I do actually appreciate the way the president-elect has positioned himself, not necessarily at the vanguard of where the Democratic Party is going, but as a kind of good faith broker in the party. And I think if that's how the administration acts, then we can see a lot of progress in 4 years.
Well, that seems like an optimistic note to me. So with that, wanted to say thank you again for joining us today. Tomorrow the World, great book. Everyone on the call should buy this and read it. It's not a super long read. You can do it in one weekend,
True.
which is what I did. It's great. Stephen, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join the Truman Project today. And I look forward to hopefully many more conversations with you.
Well, I would love that. This was a real thrill.
Thanks for us too. Have a good one. Bye.